Did you ever play a game and just stop and wondered how it all works behind the scenes? As you can imagine, after years of modding, I've learned a lot about the inner workings of Just Cause 3, especially when it comes to vehicles. So let me show you how they work. Let's just start off with some basics. When you extract all of the game's files, this is what you will get. These folders contain all of the game's files. But don't feel overwhelmed. Only a few of those are actually useful for this video's topic. The most important folder is the editor folder, which is everything from vehicles to weapons, over characters and standalone objects that are used throughout the world. The models folder has high resolution textures for the previously mentioned assets stored in the editor folder, among a bunch of other things. There's also the settings folder, which yes, does actually have settings for a bunch of things, but also lists of vehicles, weapons, characters and objects that can be spawned. Another less obvious folder is the profile folder, which has the layout for the rebel drop and gear mods menu. But I haven't really looked into that, so I won't be explaining that. But let's actually get to the good stuff now. At a very basic level, vehicles, weapons, NPCs, objects, locations and missions are made up of two things. All resources like models, textures, effects, etc. and a property file that tells the game how to put all these things together. For assets in the editor folder, most of the resources are in a .ee file. Think of it simply like a zip file. A file with more files in it. The resource file for missions and challenges has a different file ending, and locations even have two files. I won't go into this now, since I'll be making a separate video on locations and missions. Don't let the file names confuse you though. They're all basically the same thing, and can be grouped together into AAF, short for Avalanche Archive Format. And fun fact, if you open any AAF in a hex editor, at the very top it will say, Avalanche Archive Format is very cool. Property file that then puts all the resources in the AAF together also has a different name depending on what it is for. But for editor assets, they're called EPE. Again, they're all the same, it's just a different file ending. The property file is usually the last thing that gets loaded in when spawning something, since everything else needs to load first. Basically, you can see the AAF as the body and the property file as the brain. The property file controls over half of everything there is. Basically, what files in the AAF get used how? Where are lights placed? What colors do they have? What causes which effect to show up? What sounds does it make? And when? What weapons are mounted to the vehicle? Where are they placed? Can they be aimed or are they fixed? When a missile hits something, do you want a regular or a nuke explosion? How many seats does a vehicle have? Does it have a shield? How long does it last? And so much more. But that's not all. You also have the stat files that control almost everything else. How fast is the car? When does it shift gears? How strong are the brakes? Does it swim or sink? How heavy is it? Where is the center of mass? How strong is the boost? How long does it last? Aerodynamics and more. This also means you can add stat files in the EPE to extend a vehicle's abilities. For example, you can add propellers and fins from a boat to a car to make it amphibious. Since vehicles have way more parts than weapons and small objects, they have an additional parts file in the models folder. It is responsible for listing all the models the vehicle has, where they are placed, if they can brake, their behavior, for example propeller, door or fixed body part, and more. The parts file then links to LOD files, which are just basic text files that then link to the actual models. LOD stands for level of detail, and every model has 5 level of detail stages. Here, LOD1 is the most detailed model that is used when standing right next to the vehicle, and LOD5 is the least detailed model that's used when you are very far away. This is done to save on resources, since you can't really see its low detail at a great distance. And this is why the LOD files are needed as a middleman between parts and models, so that we can link 5 models to one vehicle part. There are also other files in the models folder, like a file responsible for telling the game where Reaper can stunt on the vehicle, and a file for telling the game how parts deform. You also have a physics file, which I can only assume handles collision of vehicle parts. But none of those can be changed with our modding tools. And finally, the models link to their textures, which are DDSC files for low resolution images, for far away, and HMDDSC for high quality ones. The DDSC textures are stored directly in the EE file, whereas the HMDDSC ones are external in the models folder, like I mentioned at the start. There's different types of textures. Diff textures, short for diffusion, are the actual texture. So for the military Jeep, you can clearly see the military paint job on it. Next up are NRM textures, short for normal. Normal textures are used to fake detail on models, by making light react like there is more detail than there actually is. This is used to get a more detailed looking model, without actually spending more of your computer's resources on more details. This explanation is very vague, and there is a lot more to it. So if you're interested in it, you can look up more videos on the topic. A lot of games use this technique. You also have MPM textures. This texture dictates the model's shading and specularity, where shading makes the texture darker and specularity makes it more shiny. I haven't messed with this myself, so I'll be linking an article on the Just Cause 2 wiki that explains it in greater detail. Almost done now. There's also alpha textures. These textures have transparency, so they are used for car windows and decals. At this point you might be wondering, but wait, there is vehicles that have multiple random colors. Do they have a different texture for each of their colors? Once again, vehicles have a special extra component, the palette file. This file lists all the colors that a vehicle can spawn with, and with it comes the last texture type, MSK textures. The mask texture works together with the diffusion texture. You can see here on the Vistosa body diffusion texture. Only the things that don't have the random color applied to them are on here, like the badge and some parts of the engine. The rest is black. Taking a look at the mask texture, we can see the black parts on here are what's ignored by the random color, and the red parts are where the random color gets applied to. This means the badge and engine still show up as you'd want them to, but all the black space gets a random color applied. The Vistosa only has one color, but cars with a secondary color have a secondary color on here as well. There are also other special components like the palette file, like a file responsible for vehicle health and files for camera placement, among other things. But now that our car has models and textures, sounds would be nice as well. Sounds are not stored in the vehicle's EE file. Instead, they're in the sounds folder inside the fmod banks folder. There is this .fmod file in the EE that is needed for the EPE to be able to load sounds. If you remove it, the vehicle won't have sounds. Say, you want to make a car use a different engine sound. You'll need to change that in the EPE. But you also need to add the fmod file from the vehicle you're taking the engine sound from, or else it won't load. How exactly the EPE, fmod, and the sound files communicate with each other is not clear, and so no real custom sound mods exist. We can replace existing sounds, but that's boring. I wanna add new sounds, but that's not possible. Something interesting about vehicle engine sounds though, there are recordings taken from real vehicles, and there's sound files for different speeds that then get seamlessly blended together by the game. There is a stat file for sounds usage that likely plugs into this as well. There are also other vehicle components like effects and animations. Effects, for example, are explosions, fire, or the nitros fire, but those aren't researched well, so I can't really show you anything about these. That would be everything interesting in the EE, but what's this? Next to the EE we can also find a .toc file. These were introduced with patches the game received. I can only assume TOC standing for Table of Contents, since all the TOC does is link to files that have been updated with game patches. The patch files are stored outside of the EE in the same file path and just overwrite the ones that are in the EE. This was done so you don't have to patch the entire EE file, which would have greatly increased update sizes. A lot of the time when you mod existing vehicles, you can ignore the TOC, but if you want to add files or even create a new vehicle, you need to use the TOC as well. This is also the reason why there is an EPE in and outside of the EE. The one in the EE is the old one that came with the first version of the game, and the one outside is the patched new one. For my mods, I just put all the patched files back into the EE to make it easier to work with, at the expense of a little more work for me, but I don't really mind. Not checking if there is an external patched file is one of the most popular mistakes new modders make. They try to change a file in the EE, but it was patched, so nothing changes in the game, since it doesn't use that one anymore. Another fun fact, DLC EE files don't have a TOC, so it looks like they just patched the entire EE whenever they updated the DLCs for some reason. You can still add custom vehicles to a DLC that have a TOC file though, there's no issue with that. And after all of this, how does the game actually spawn a car? By its file name? Not directly. This brings us back to the settings folder. As you can see, boats, planes, weapons, civilians, rebels, and the military each have their own spawn definitions list here. Taking a look at the spawn vehicle definitions file, we can see entries for every vehicle that is allowed to spawn in the game. This here is the entry for the Vistosa. The name at the top is what the game actually uses to spawn it. This can be anything, it doesn't have to be the same as the file name. Then we have this debug line, which is not important for the regular game. In development builds, this dictates where the vehicle is in the developer spawn menu. The entity line has the file path to the vehicle's EE file. The tags line has various info about the car, which I don't exactly know what it is used for. And anything below that I also have no idea. But well, that's all I know about vehicles. If you find this interesting and want to learn even more about the inner workings of the game, I've made some modding tutorials you can check out as well. If you still have questions beyond what was covered here, feel free to hop into the Just Cause Discord and ask me anything in the modding channel. All of that is of course linked below. But that's it for me. I'll see you next time.